I was watching something on YouTube of another presentation that you gave, and you introed in that with saying, and I really want the listeners to hear this because I had never heard it before, that there are, I believe, 6,500 genetic differences between male and female. Wow. So this isn't as simple as taking some hormones and getting some surgery and being the opposite.
Right. So there's only right. So the sex chromosomes determine your sex at fertilization, but we now know that in addition to that sex chromosome difference, there are at least 6,500 other genetic differences. Wow. And what's fascinating is these are 6,500 genes that are found in both men and women, but depending on your sex, they function differently, or they produce different amounts of the same protein. There's a different expression of those genes, and that's what's phenomenal. And as you point out, wow, that's the reason that sex does not change and cannot change. I don't care what drugs, hormones you give a person, you will not alter their genetics. And the same thing with surgery. I don't care what body parts you mutilate or what fake pieces you attach on, you will not change that person's sex because you are not changing their genetic makeup.
For many Americans, the great tragedy of trans rights is the story of how Republican governors and state legislatures are stigmatizing some of society's most put-upon people, all too often in a cynical search for votes. However, nestled within that first tragedy appears to be a second, this time a tragedy of good intentions. Broadly speaking, the consensus in America is that medical intervention and gender affirmation are beneficial and should be more accessible. Across Europe, several countries now believe that the evidence is lacking and such interventions should be used sparingly and need further study. The Europeans are right.
I became alarmed back in 2019 after I realized I was seeing more kids with gender dysphoria, and every single one I referred to the gender clinic was being transitioned. And so when an average pediatrician sees a kid with gender issues, they're not sure what to do. The whole thing is very complicated. And so they want to refer to the experts. But I do think most pediatricians don't realize that if they send a kid to the gender clinic, the probability of transition is very high, that there's no careful evaluation or differential diagnosis being performed. I don't think that many people know that young people can walk into a Planned Parenthood in many different states and just walk out with hormones. But the Planned Parenthoods are operating on what's called an informed consent model. And if they sign a piece of paper saying that they acknowledge the risks, then they can be given these powerful hormones with irreversible side effects.
This has been documented not only at clinics in the United States, but also across Europe. A several thousand% increase in teenage girls in particular. The ratio now is about 80% girls, 20% boys with gender dysphoria.
The long-term effects of puberty blockers remain unknown, though there are worries about brain development and decreasing bone density.
It's often said that puberty blockers are reversible, but this, I think, is disingenuous on multiple levels. So the first is that the majority of children who are started on puberty blockers, over 95% go on to take cross-sex hormones. Because they are the first step in sequential treatment pathway, puberty blockers cannot be considered a standalone intervention. Most children who develop gender dysphoria will have resolution of that gender dysphoria by the time they reach adulthood. No one really understands the process or the timing of that resolution, but the studies that we do have show that, depending upon study, somewhere between roughly 65 and 98% of children who have gender dysphoria as kids will not have clinically significant gender dysphoria as adults. But this fact seems to be forgotten by medicine currently. The fact they're being offered outside of clinical trials, despite the fact there's so much unknown about long-term risk, is a scandal in and of itself.
On different sides of the Atlantic, medical experts have weighed the evidence for the treatment of gender dysphoric children and teenagers. This treatment is life-changing and can lead to infertility.
One of the big news stories overnight, the NHS to close the UK's only dedicated gender identity clinic for children and young people.
NHS England has announced the closure of its controversial gender identity clinic for children after an independent report found it was not fit for purpose.
They too saw a 4,000% increase in teen girls seeking care, and they hired a pediatrician named Hilary Cass to write a report. We don't have the final report, we have the interim report, and it diagnosed the system with a problem, including things like diagnostic overshadowing, which means that once a kid is identified as having gender issues, all of his or her other issues are ignored.
The kids that Tavistock sees have many other problems. They have very high rates of autistic spectrum disorders, self-harm, depression, anxiety, all of these sorts of things. And those things aren't dealt with because there's this weird way that as soon as somebody says gender, they don't do anything else.
So when you have a population with multiple mental health comorbidities and only the gender dysphoria is being treated with the assumption that the other issues will go away, what you have is kids getting very, very poor treatment.
And the second problem is that the Tavistock has this hugely ideological approach. It hasn't been doing good medicine. It hasn't been keeping records. It hasn't been doing proper research. It hasn't been investigating the reasons behind a child's trans identity. They've just been assuming that a child who says, I'm trans, is trans, and putting them on these very poorly researched pathways with puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones.
The US is getting more out of step with the rest of the world every day. There are several progressive countries, that the ones that like pioneered pediatric gender transition, and they are reconsidering what they've been doing. Sweden was the first country to recognize, the legal status of trans people. And they just issued new guidelines where they say gender transitioning of minors should only be done for exceptional cases and in tightly controlled clinical studies. And there are no studies going on right now. Finland did the similar thing 2 years ago. In the last 12 months, we've heard from the French Academy of Medicine, the Australian psychiatrists, and the Italian psychoanalysts all expressing concern. So all of these changes, or at least in Sweden, Finland, and England, followed a commissioned systematic review of the evidence, which found either no benefits to youth gender transitions or even that the harms outweighed the benefits.
The US is refusing, the American Academy of Pediatrics is refusing to do a systematic evidence review. So is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. They also wrote in their recently released guidelines that they could not conduct a systematic evidence review because the research is so scant. That is not true. Other countries did them. The state of Florida did them. They all came to the same conclusion.
The American Academy of Pediatrics National Conference and Exhibition is being held this year in Anaheim, California. With over 10,000 doctors attending, a group took the opportunity to come as well.
So it's important to realize that when we hear 22 professional organizations support affirmation, this is not the voice of the average pediatrician. It's the position of a few activists that have captured key committees at these medical societies and are using the bureaucracy to ensure the voice of regular pediatricians isn't heard.
So it's almost like the gender dysphoria moves around. At first, it's like focused on the voice, and then they take testosterone and the voice deepens, but then it's like, well, then they have chest dysphoria and they want to get rid of their breasts, and then they have a mastectomy and it still doesn't work.
That is the road of transition. It's this always looking for the next solution, the next solution.
When kids say, this doesn't matter to me because what really matters to me is my gender identity, and I'll do anything to affirm my gender identity, and I don't care about having kids, and I don't care about sexual function. It seems to me that it's extremely naive of the adults in that person's life to go along with that, because we know that kids change their minds.
And this isn't a fringe thing. We're not talking about 1 or 2 kids here and there. We're talking about tens of thousands of children. Just on GoFundMe alone, right now, there are over 40,000 girls raising money for what they call top surgery, which is the euphemism given for radical elective double mastectomy.
Okay, so I haven't made a vlog in a really long time, just because, I don't know, I've been busy, things have been happening, but I did want to make one, but I was told that I had to make one after I came back from Florida, because I went down to Florida, obviously, to see Dr. Garamoni to do my top surgery. Yeah. I don't know what to say, really.
The only other time that I can think of that we addressed some psychological problem with a physical intervention was with lobotomies. And, lobotomy was a surgery, and it was very popular at the time. It was hailed as a kind of miracle cure. And the person who invented the procedure won a Nobel Prize. But we discovered that these procedures did a lot of damage. And, they fell out of favor pretty shortly after they came on the scene. And now we think of it as pretty barbaric.
These doctors and therapists put me through this. They had no reason to, except for the fact that I said it.
The American Academy of Pediatrics issued a new policy statement stating that the affirmative model was the right way, that whatever a child says about him or her or their self, we all affirm and go with, and we don't question.
It seems like all of this is based on the fear that if you don't affirm a child's identity right away, they're going to be at a high risk of suicide.
We're living in an age where there's the whole, do you want a dead daughter or a live son thing going on, right? And parents are being intimidated and coerced into, if you don't affirm right away, your kid's going to commit suicide. Well, that's a really dangerous thing to tell people.
All of the clinicians that are actually tracking current rates of self-harm and suicide will tell you, luckily, the suicide rate is quite low. And it's not a legitimate outcome. And that we don't know medicalizing reduces suicide.
Doctors have really been transmitting this information in a forceful, authoritative way. Puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones will provide relief from depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts and reduce the future risk of suicide, etc. But the reality is that these interventions have not been shown to do those things.
In the United States, there are 22 professional organizations that have lined up behind gender affirmation. And these professional organizations are putting a thumb on the scale, not only by silencing their own members, but by stifling debate in the medical journals. For example, in 2020, the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, called Pediatrics, published a study by Jack Turbin, a young psychiatrist, and he basically data mined a massive online survey to try to show that puberty blockers prevent suicides. This is convenient sample data and it cannot prove any sort of cause and effect, but he made that claim and it was written up in all the major media. And we found out later that Dr. Turbin had received a substantial grant from a drug company that makes puberty blockers. He hadn't disclosed that. When researchers wrote to Pediatrics about all the errors in the study, each of them was told there was no space to publish their rebuttals. You know, an ordinary pediatrician, if he reads any journals at all, it's going to be Pediatrics, right? Because you get it for free. It shows up. Like, it's delivered to your house if you're an AAP member. So, like, and it's supposed to be a really high quality journal, but it is not covering itself in glory on this topic.
The evidence that's most often cited comes from these surveys where they just ask kids about suicidality, and there's lots of problems with that evidence, because of course kids think if you're trans you have to be suicidal. Girls taking testosterone are less likely to express suicidality, which makes sense because actually testosterone is an antidepressant. We know that we can use it in men as an antidepressant, but boys taking estrogen are more suicidal. And of course, if the kids believe that this is life-saving medical treatment, you're getting a massive placebo response. I've actually done research on the world's largest youth gender clinic in London, known as the Tavistock, to investigate the actual number of deaths by suicide. Out of 15,000 patients over 10 years, they've had 4 suicides. Now, those are 4 terrible tragedies, of course. But as you can see, suicide, thankfully, is very, very rare. Now, the suicide rate for these patients is higher than the overall population, perhaps 5 or 6 times higher. But we can't conclude that this elevated risk is directly related to transgender identity, because many of these kids have other psychological conditions that we know increase the risk of suicide, like depression, eating disorders, and autism. The crucial question, of course, is whether puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones reduce or increase the actual risk of suicide. And the honest answer is that we just don't know, because we lack good quality evidence. For what it's worth, of the 4 suicides at the Tavistock, 2 came from patients on the waiting list and 2 from patients undergoing treatment. So there's no evidence that taking cross-sex hormones reduces the risk of suicide.
It's just not true that these kids are more likely to complete a suicide if they're not given these interventions. And in fact, there was a study looking at the Swedish population of those who had transitioned that found that those who had transitioned had suicide rates 19 times higher than population matched controls.
A study in the Tavistock, which is the largest gender clinic for children in the world, and they showed 48% of those children presenting, seeking to medicalize their identity, were autistic. And I remember talking to one teenager, and we were discussing how testosterone is very hard on the female body. And she said, yeah, I'm very well aware of that, and it's really bad on the female body, but it's okay for me because, you see, I'm really male. And she didn't realize, no, we have physical limitations with our body, and you have been frankly lied to believe that what's in your mind is actually impacting the chromosomes in your body and the cells in your body. They're not.
I've spoken with probably 100 parents of children with autism. They all tell me the same things, that their children tend to think more black and white, and they tend to fixate on this issue of gender when they've been introduced to it in school or online. And so once this ideology has already gotten in their head, it can be a lot harder to reach them.
There can be a lot of anxiety in people with autism because they have the same feelings as the rest of us. They're just not able to interpret what all's happening to trigger those feelings. They already know there's something different about them. They've probably been bullied for being different, and that's very painful. The autistic mind also loves a nice concrete black and white narrative that explains everything. And again, that can leave them susceptible to an ideology that says, here's why you feel different. Here's why you feel bad and awkward. And here's a solution. Here's your comprehensive plan, step by step, for what you should do next.
Sex means literally, are you male or female? In science, sex is defined by what role you play in reproduction. Male plants produce pollen, female plants produce the fruit and the seed. And mammalian animals, like human beings, we're mammals. The male produces the sperm, the female produces the egg, and gives birth to a live baby. That's sex. Are you male? Are you female? And it is determined by genetics, by your genes on the sex chromosomes. You know, the females do not have the Y chromosome or any of those sex genes that are found on the Y chromosome. Only males do. But, you know, are you masculine? Are you feminine? Well, that's going to vary with culture. And there's a saying, nouns have gender, people have sex. And we say that because, for example, in Romance languages, French, Spanish, right? I'll take Spanish. If I have a female friend, the word is amiga. If I have a male friend, the word is amigo. The words have a gender. The people have a sex.
These teenagers are very, very influenced by the most alluring concept that I've ever heard, which is if you take these drugs, you can be somebody different with a different name, and nobody will be able to mention or even refer to that old, awkward, lost kid. Nobody will be able to refer to them. You can be this new, and remarkably like that person on YouTube, new, sunny, social kind of butterfly person. And that is at the end of the rainbow if you just medically transition. That's in your power.
That's what I hear. I have ruined my life. I've ruined my body. I've ruined my health. I had a perfectly good body, and now it's ruined. And I've heard that, you know, repeatedly from detransitioners, and it's a horrible feeling.
These vulnerable people were treated incredibly badly by the professionals. They failed very badly because people told them that they could have an easier life if they transitioned, and it turned out to be a much more difficult life. People who've fallen in with the principle of first do no harm have actually harmed young, vulnerable people to an incomprehensible degree.
Clinicians, you know, we've been sold a bill of lies, and I honestly feel for all my colleagues who are still doing the affirmation thing, who really think that they're doing the right thing. They really think they're on the right side of history. I understand that. That's going to come crashing down at some point, and it's going to be really hard to reckon with what they've done. Same with the teachers, doctors, and parents.
We're rushing to make a permanent medical transformation. I can't think of anything that I've seen in my time as a therapist that is more terrifying and destructive. I don't know what the long-term impact will be.